Hello and welcome to Crushing Comics, the show where I fall in love with my comic book collection all over again. I'm going to pluck something right off the wall here. This is actually a special brown paper variant that I know is one of the first couple ones I packed, because after that I started putting the paper on the inside. So as I put this shirt on today, I actually thought about this concept of, did you like weird stuff when you were a little kid? Like, I don't mean food, right? Every kid has a different palate, different taste buds. I mean stuff that entertained you that you didn't really know a lot of other kids who were entertained by that. Everybody's got their thing. Mine was like, I think I was a weirdly macabre little child, because the first book I ever read was Bram Stoker's Dracula. I mean, not like the full version, but a child's adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And then I proceeded to read all of these like monster books, and also Bunnicula, so I was really into vampires. And one of my favorite movies then and now was Clue. And Clue is a movie about a bunch of murder in the 1950s, as with like the Red Scare as a red herring for blackmail. And it's just not the kind of movie you think of a 5-year-old would like. It's got some like slapstick and sort of like Britishy types of humor, so I guess I maybe was into that as a kid. But it was a movie about a lot of dead bodies too. And so I was a strange child. And it just makes me think now, like, as you see, you know, if you have kids or if you have kids in your family or that you interact with, and you look at that one thing that's like so weird that they're into, like you think about 20 or 30 years later, and then they're wearing a cute Clue t-shirt and they're on the internet making videos about their comic book collection. So you never know how these things are going to turn out. Okay, let's see what we have here. Oh my gosh, there's a whole other layer that I could have been opening. Oh, okay. Alright. This was either the first or second one I wrapped back in Philly. So, I got this at the very last moment before we left. I haven't unwrapped it yet. It's the X-Force by Rob Liefeld Omnibus. I'm almost ashamed that I bought it in hardcover. Not because I don't like the material, it is what it is, but because I have this in non-oversized collections. I'm probably completely in floppies with the exception of maybe New Mutants 98, which is Deadpool's first appearance. So the reason I actually bought this right before we left is because Marvel announced that there was going to be a second X-Force Omnibus, which a lot of people had given up hope on, but Marvel suddenly has like found the urge to put some of this 90s stuff in Omnibus, partly because of the Deadpool movie, but other 90s Omnibus lines are moving too. It's great, because Marvel, it's one of their most under-collected periods. And they announced the second one is going to be called Deadpool and X-Force, which is hilarious because he was just like an occasional guest star at that point. And I haven't been all in on the Deadpool omnibus lines. I just don't need all of those omnibuses. Like, I'm not going to read Deadpool in a 12-volume set. But, and then plus I have it all in classic collections. But I do have this thing about wanting a complete X-Men shelf. And so knowing there was going to be a continuation in oversized and knowing that it was being clearance at the time, I was like, okay, fine, I'll buy it. And so I bought it. But here's the thing, I actually have a lot of affinity for this period of X-Force. So here's what happened. New Mutants had been so magical at the beginning. It's really quite good if you read the early years that are like Claremont and Sienkiewicz, especially in the 20s with like Demon Bear and the Legion stuff. But over time had just kind of like dwindled away. Louise Simonson takes it over, and she'd been so great on X Factor, but she just, New Mutants wasn't quite as great. And so it's kind of like floundering in the 70s. It's got good characters, it's interesting, but it just doesn't have like the boldness of some of the other X-Men books. And so this hot artist, Rob Liefeld, comes onto the title and decides that he wants to start introducing more characters and concepts that he wants to develop. And one of the earliest ones, of course, is Cable, who cameos, I think, at the very end of issue 86, and then he makes his full debut in 87. And Cable becomes one of the big forces in X-Men, not because his character is so significant, although in some ways it is, but because of who he is to the X-Men, although that was just very implied at this point. Who he is, spoiler alert, is actually Cyclops and Madeline Pryor's son, who had been transported to the future, which I guess Liefeld couldn't have known at the time when he created him, because that was like just happening in X Factor. Actually, maybe it hadn't even happened yet in X Factor. So anyway, he didn't know. But he was driving this team in a different direction, not just because the 90s were into like extreme pads and guns and things, which honestly, this run like made that happen to a degree, but because there was this idea of like, what are these kids doing? It was the first time that we had X-Men students in a sort of like arrested development where we were like, they're just gonna keep staying in school, and we're coming up with 100 issues, and it's like, how long can you keep these kids in school, right? Some of them had gone. We pretty much from the original class, we just had, by the time we got to X-Force, we just had Sunspot and Cannonball, but like, where was the maturity? Where was the growth? Where was the change? Especially in light of what was happening in the X-Men franchise and with all of the original X-Men kind of getting pushed all together at the Xavier School, which really wasn't a school at that point. What were these kids going to do to find their identity? And Liefeld, like him or hate him, taps into this really smart urge to say, well, the thing they would do is want to break off and go on their own, right? Like, what's the equivalent of college for young mutants? And for them, it was this idea to have the equal and opposite reaction to, they always put it as like, you know, Xavier's the open hand, and Magneto, and sometimes X-Force, is the closed fist. And to say, like, we should be forceful, we should be out there being proactive. It's not about, you know, waiting for permission to protect our race, and it's not about waiting for the public's approval. We should just do what we need to do. Now, that sounds actually like a pretty awesome concept. As you're reading the book, though, like, it doesn't really hang together quite so well as that, because they're still kind of just being thrust into situation after situation. They're kind of on the defensive with this mutant liberation front, and in a way that on reread, you're kind of like, wait, where did all this come from? And I'll give Liefeld this, for all of his awesome character designs, he actually really implied that there was going to be a lot of stuff that was going to happen, and I remember reading at the time, like, wow, this is so cool, what's going to happen with all these plots? And a lot of them actually did get picked up and resolved, because Fabian, oh, I'm so bad with names, we know this, Fabian Nicieza, I have to think that's right. Fabian Nicieza winds up taking over the writing duties and staying on it for quite a long time, I think into the 40s. And he was one of the best writers of this like X-Men as family, and he wasn't like corny like Lobdell could be. He was the good one. And he also was responsible, by the way, for the vast majority of New Warriors, which was another great like young hero team as family thing. It was his specialty. And so he actually makes a lot of the threads from the initial Liefeld stuff track. So what's in this omnibus? It starts with, I believe it starts with 98, yeah, New Mutants 98, which is Deadpool's first appearance. New Mutants then ends on New Mutants 100. Most of the team is jettisoned, and at that point we get Domino, Shatterstar, Warpath, who we had met already. He had been a Hellion in White Queen School. Feral. So Liefeld just kind of like drops this whole new team in. It's really the equivalent of like giant-sized X-Men in terms of how many characters appear and are suddenly a part of the franchise. And then it actually has this series of annual crossovers that was from that summer, which was called Kings of Pain, that went through New Mutants, New Warriors, X-Men, and X-Factor. And then it has the first, how many issues? 15 issues of X-Force, which is, you know, enough to get a flavor, but the X-Force that I think of really fondly just was getting started at this point, and I think it really came into its own in the 20s. So, do I recommend picking up this book? Look, there's going to be an X-Force movie. Cable's about to be really big next year. I think you could probably get away with reading this digitally. I think you could probably find copies of it for like 50 cents each. I don't know if you need it in omnibus necessarily. I don't know. I need to I've reread these comics many, many times, and I think I need to sit down and like really read it end to end with the next omnibus to really decide for myself like how much it hangs together. It's not bad comics, but you know what? Really none of X-Men in the early 90s was bad comics. It took much later, past Age of Apocalypse, past Onslaught, before there started being like crappy X-Men comics. But at the time as a reader, I remember this was like probably one of my lesser favorites, especially because it was up against like the bombast of X-Men and Uncanny X-Men, and then Peter David just reinventing X-Factor, and Alan Davis taking over Excalibur, which is my favorite comic of all time. So on my list of weird things that I liked as a kid, Excalibur, pretty high. X-Force, which a lot of other kids probably at the time really liked, not as high. So that is a little bit of the story about this X-Force omnibus. It is volume 1, and we're getting something that's kind of volume 2, but it's not called volume 2, and it's not going to look right next to the spine, because Marvel's doing all these wacky things on the spine that's not as plain as these old ones anymore. So now for the official shelving of X-Force omnibus. I mean, there's a big world of gap between Inferno Prologue and then X-Force and the new X-Men on the other side, but we're going to fill in some of that. So thank you so much for watching. Tune in next time as we continue unpacking my wall of oversized, mostly Marvel, but not quite all Marvel books, and falling in love with this comic book collection all over again. Thanks so much.